Before you begin, I would like you to go onto the sheet that I gave you. Go ahead and fill out the second column that's labeled symbol, and go through those elements and on your periodic table and tell me the symbols for each of those before you start filling out the rest of the chart. Okay, now we are going to talk about the four parts of the world that involve these elements that we've been talking about. So the first part of the world that we need to talk about, and this goes in your third column, is the Earth's crust. The Earth's crust, and go ahead and write that in your first, or the column right after symbol. The second part of the world that we need to talk about and that you need to put in your fourth column is living matter. So living matter is the next one that goes in your table next to Earth's crust. The third part of the world that we're going to talk about is oceans. So go ahead and put that down there, oceans. And then the fourth and last one is dry atmosphere. Dry atmosphere. And go ahead and write those down. Oopsie, atmosphere. I can't spell apparently. So you have the four parts that we are going to be talking about. Let me make this more clear for you. We've got Earth's crust. We've got Earth's crust, that's number one. Then we've got living matter. Then we've got oceans. And then we have dry atmosphere. The top part of your table should be completely filled out now. In column 1, I've already filled that out for you. That's element name. The column 2, I've already filled that out for you. That's the symbol. Next is the Earth's crust that you've written. Then living matter. Then oceans. Then dry atmosphere. So the top part of your table should be filled out by now. So if you look at your table, you see that there are not that many elements as compared to the periodic table. On this chart, there's only about 13 of those elements that we see on the periodic table. We know that the periodic table has around 111 elements. But if we're talking about the elements that we see and we use and we come in contact with in our world, here's a world for you. Beautiful. If we see the elements that we come in contact with in our world, there's only 13, around 13, give or take a few. There's only 13 of them. And so one thing that you need to know is that all these elements, we don't really use them. We only really use and come into contact with 13. It's a very small amount that we come into contact with. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to walk you through this table, and you are going to fill out how much percent of these elements make up Earth's crust, living matter, oceans, and dry atmosphere. Now let me get one thing straight. We are not going to fill out every one for the Earth's crust, and we're not going to fill out every one for living matter because some elements aren't in the Earth's crust, and some elements aren't in living matter, and some aren't in oceans or dry atmosphere. There are only a few of each of these elements in each of these four parts of the Earth. So you need to listen carefully and fill out your chart based on what I say. So the first, let's talk about Earth's crust. So I'm going to write this down. Earth's crust. I'm going to let that brown. Earth's crust. Now there are a good handful amount of these elements that you see on your chart that make up Earth's crust. First is aluminum. And I'm just going to put the symbol for aluminum on there because so we can save some space. But aluminum is the first element in the Earth's crust, and that makes up 8% of Earth's crust. 8%. So in your table for aluminum in the Earth's crust, I want you to put 8%. Right, 8% for aluminum in the Earth's crust. The next element that we see in the Earth's crust is oxygen. which is right underneath aluminum. So you should see in your box oxygen. And what I'm going to put the symbol for oxygen. Let me write that down. And oxygen in the Earth's crust is about 47%. And remember, I just want you to write the percent sign in the box. Now, obviously, since there's no carbon and there's no nitrogen in the Earth's crust, we're not going to put anything in those boxes. So we've got aluminum at 8% and oxygen at 47%. The next element in the Earth's crust is silicon. And I believe that symbol for silicon is Si, so that's what I'm going to put. And the percentage for silicon is 28%. 28%. Moving on, we have sodium. The element symbol for sodium is Na, and there is about 3% of sodium in the Earth's crust. Not very much sodium, but there is a little bit. Moving on, we're going to skip chlorine because there's no chlorine in the Earth's crust, but there is magnesium and calcium. So magnesium, there is about 2%. Magnesium has about 2% in the Earth's crust, and calcium, I believe that's Ca. Calcium has about 4%. So you should be filling out your chart as we're going along. Moving on, the last known element in the Earth's crust is iron, and that's Fe. You don't have to write the symbol, remember, just write the percentage, and there is about 6%. 6% of iron in the Earth's crust. Now, what I want you to do for that, for the other boxes, I want you to leave them blank because there isn't any of these other elements in the Earth's crust. So your column for Earth's crust should have aluminum, oxygen, silicon, sodium, magnesium, calcium, iron, and then finally we have potassium. Potassium is the last one. That is K, and there is about 2% of of potassium in the Earth's crust. So you should have these percentages in your chart for Earth's crust in your table. As we can see, with all these total percentages, for every column, it's going to end up equaling 100% because all of these things make up 100% of the Earth's crust. The next few elements make up 100% of living matter, and so on and so forth. But if we added up these percentages, it would equal up to 100 because these are the elements that make up the Earth's crust. As you can see, oxygen is the biggest element in the Earth's crust, and so I want you to circle 47 on your chart. That's how you know that is the biggest element in the Earth's crust. Next, we have living matter. Living matter is the next part, and living matter has not as many elements as the Earth's crust does, but it does have a good handful. The first element that we see in living matter is carbon. Carbon has about 21% of living matter. Carbon makes up about 21%. Next is nitrogen. Nitrogen is about 9%. There's about 9% of nitrogen in living matter. The biggest one that we see in living matter is oxygen. Oxygen makes up about 59%. Makes up about 59% of the living matter. The last two ones are hydrogen and other elements. But the first, for hydrogen, we have about 9%. And for the other elements that scientists aren't too sure on, we're just going to put 2% for the other elements that we haven't exactly pinpointed. But as you can see, the oxygen makes up the majority of living matter, and I want you to put a squiggly line around it like this. That's how I know you know that oxygen makes up most of living matter. Now we have oceans, and I'm going to make that pretty because oceans are fun. A-N-S. All right, so now we're going to do oceans. And oceans are made of very few elements. So let's get started. Oceans, first off, we have oxygen. We have oxygen, and there is about 5% of oxygen in our oceans. Next, we have sodium, Na, and there's a good handful of sodium. There is, let me see here, we've got about 30%. 30% of the ocean is sodium. 30% of the ocean is sodium. And then next we have chlorine. Now, I know that you think of chlorine as in a pool, but there also is some chlorine in our oceans, and it makes up, when I say some, I actually mean a lot, because there is about 54% of chlorine in our oceans. That's an interesting fact. In the other elements box, I want you to write 8%, because there are a few other elements that we're not very sure of that make up 8% of our oceans. And then finally we have sulfur. And sulfur is about only 3%. 3% of our oceans. So what I want you to do is I want you to box chlorine. I know we have been circling our greatest element, but now to make sure that you're listening to this, I want to make sure that you have a box around 54%, just to say that that is the highest. Make sure it's a box and doesn't look like a circle. Make sure that it is a box. Chlorine makes up the majority of our oceans. Last but not least, we have our dry atmosphere, and this means the air around us. Now let me finish this, atmosphere. And one thing that a lot of people think of initially is when they think of the air, they think of the air they breathe, and that's exactly what they should think of. But when I ask what kind of element do we think that we breathe in the most, and a lot of people say oxygen, because we do breathe in oxygen. But what most people do not know is that the dry atmosphere, the biggest element, the element that makes up most of the dry atmosphere, and this is something that you need to know, you need to memorize and know for your test and know for your checkpoints, is that nitrogen. Nitrogen makes up a huge part of the dry atmosphere, and by huge, I mean a whopping 78%. That is very important for you to know, that nitrogen makes up the majority of dry atmosphere. Now, there is oxygen. That's our next element. Oxygen there's about 21% of oxygen in our dry atmospheres. So first and foremost, we have nitrogen, and then we've got oxygen. And last but not least, we're going to put in the others column, we're going to put 1%. 1%, because there is other elements make up about 1% of that dry atmosphere. So this is huge. I want you to put a triangle around your 78%. Your 78%, I want you to put a triangle, because that is how I know you're going to be listening. Also, I really want you to remember that nitrogen makes up most of our dry atmosphere. That is very important for you to know. So, I want you to go back through your table and make sure that all your percentages add up to 100%. You see at the bottom of your table that there is a total, and it says total 100%, but that's because all of those elements end up adding to 100%. Now, you don't have all your boxes full, because some of these elements aren't in these certain parts of the world. But you need to know, a few things that you do need to know in summary is that there are only a few elements on the periodic table that make up the four parts of the world. And within those few elements, there's even fewer that make up those different parts. As we see in dry atmosphere, only 3 different elements make up the dry atmosphere. And so not a lot of the periodic table is things that we come into contact with, but there is some things that we do come into contact with a lot, and nitrogen is a big, big part of that. What I want you to do now is I want you to flip to the back side, and you are going to write a secret message, and this is for all those people that are still listening and still following directions. I want you to write on the back of your paper. This is what I want you to write. This will give you extra credit. If you write this on the back of your paper, then I will know that you have listened to the whole lesson. I want you to write, Berry Bears are number one. I want you to write Berry Bears are number one on the back of your sheet. Make sure you put your name on the front, and then I want you to turn it in.